What's up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. This week, we're doing an Innistrad Remastered Draft Primer. So, this is a set coming out next week, January 24th. It's paper and MTGO only, so not Arena for this one, but I know there's a lot of people going to their LGS next week, hoping to draft this one. Looks pretty sweet from initial glance. I want to get you as prepared as possible for that, so let's just jump in. So, first up, what is this set? You might have seen your LGS offering drafts of this, going, okay, it looks kind of cool, I like Innistrad. But what's actually going on here? So, as the name suggests, this is a remastered set, which means there's no new cards here. It's all reprints, and you can kind of think of this as just the best of the best from all three main times we've been on Innistrad before. So that's OG Innistrad block with Dark Ascension and Avacyn Restored, then Shadows over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon, and most recently Midnight Hunt plus Crimson Bow. There's also a handful of cards that weren't originally from any of these Innistrad blocks, but they've kind of repurposed with Innistrad flavor. So if you're like, hey, I don't remember Mass Hysteria or Hermit Druid being in any of the Innistrad sets, that's why you're seeing them here. And also, often these are more high value cards, some of the money cards in the set. The power level you should expect from the set is something notable. So this being a remastered set, these tend to be a little bit more powerful than your average draft set. Both in just like the cards that they've selected, like I said, it's kind of the best of the best, and that's not just for constructed purposes, but also the sweetest, the most fun, the most powerful cards from the limited sets. But also, there's a lot of downshifts in rarity, and you see this all the time in these kind of remastered sets, where we've got uncommons that are now commons, we've got rares that are now uncommons. I've got two notable downshifts on screen here. These are both uncommons in their original set, but are now commons in this set, Brambleworm and Seize the Storm. And don't worry, for those listening audio only, we're gonna dive into these cards a little bit later, but just a little bit of a hint of what to expect as far as power level goes. And while not strictly limited strategy related, I do think it's worth calling out, since this is mostly a set that's gonna be drafted in paper, it's a little more expensive than your average standard legal draft set, so I would really recommend going to look up what the money cards are. I think Edgar Markov leading the pack is like an $80 card or something like that. Also, a lot of cool treatments of the cards. We've got like the retro frame on some of the cards. Also, they brought back the Odyssey Tombstone in the corner for those who've been playing for, 25 years at this point. The Odyssey Tombstone at the top corner, just noting that this card does something in the graveyard, if you're just wondering what that is. So you'll see that on like flashback cards or cards that bring themselves back from the graveyard. So yeah, just some cool treatments to look out for, and I would recommend just taking a quick look at the price list of this set, just so you don't feel bad when you pass a $25 card or something like that. So let's talk about the archetypes that you're going to see, the 10 two-color pairs. And one thing that I didn't notice actually until making this episode was every time we've been to Innistrad, the 10 two-color pairs are roughly all the same every single time. I mean, it's kind of obvious with the 5 allied color pairs, the 5 creature types you see in Innistrad, the werewolves, zombies, vampire spirits, and humans, but it's even true for the enemy color pairs too. Like, blue-green has been self-mill almost every single time, red-white's been go-wide aggro, black-white's been sacrifice, black-green has been morbid, and blue-red has been spells. One slightly weird thing about the gold uncommons in this set is that they're not evenly distributed amongst the 10 archetypes. Like, some of the archetypes get 2 or 3 gold uncommons, and some of them technically don't get any. The deck we're starting with, red-green werewolves, doesn't actually even get a true gold 2-color signpost uncommon. It instead gets a monocolored red card, Ulrich's Kindred, that has a green activated ability. So if you're looking through the set being like, oh, yo, where's my deck's gold card? It might not be there once in a while, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the deck is unsupported, because it'll be supported in other places with, for example, Halpak Resurgence, which is a card that is effectively a gold card. This is the green enchantment that has flash, that says each creature you control that's a wolf or a werewolf gets +1/+1 and has trample. They didn't just randomly go, oh, we're not going to support the wolves or the werewolves, but the support cards might not be in the places you're looking. That's all. So yeah, let's jump in, starting with red-green werewolves. So the pseudo gold uncommon here, Ulrich's Kindred, is a 3-mana 3/2 trample in red, and it has the activated ability 3 and a green, target attacking wolf or werewolf gains indestructible until end of turn. This card's solid, nothing too special, but never gonna cut it from my werewolf deck. We've got the aforementioned Halpak Resurgence, which is an anthem for your wolves and werewolves. Also has flash, which is notable because the werewolf mechanic, the transforming, not quite day and night, actually. Day and night specifically is not in this set, but the older werewolf mechanic, the kind of proto day and night, still does appreciate instant cards, flash cards. And then one of the stronger payoffs, I think potentially even the strongest, Moonlight Hunt is a instant 1 and a green. It's a removal spell at uncommon. Choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control that's a wolf or werewolf deals its damage equal to its power to that creature. So sort of a bite spell that doesn't even need you to target. In a wolf deck, in a heavy werewolf wolf deck, this is effectively just going to be a 2-mana kill anything, so a really strong payoff. You're going to find 2 types of transforming werewolves in this set. Like I mentioned, no actual day-night mechanic where you have to introduce the day-night tracker. Very happy they did that. Day-night is kind of a nightmare in paper. I think it's something that they regret doing in hindsight. But we do have the proto day night where it's just kind of spelled out on the cards, the kind of werewolves you'd find in OG Innistrad and Shadows over Innistrad. As an example, Gaia Rage Bandit is 2 and a red for a 3/2 haste at uncommon. It's a werewolf, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform this creature. The backside is a 4/3 that says whenever a werewolf you control enters, you may transform it. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, you transform this back to the front side, the kind of weaker side. So yeah, even if you haven't played with these before, it's got pretty much the same play patterns as those day-night werewolves. These cards do play well with instants, they play well with activated abilities, basically anything that lets you spend mana in a way that isn't casting a spell on your turn so your werewolves can flip more often. The other kind of transforming werewolves that you'll see just transform with a mana cost, an activated ability mana cost, which gives you a mana sink so that you're not casting spells in your turn. So Shrill Howler, as an example here, this is a 2 and a green 3/1 at uncommon that says creatures with power less than this creature can't block it. You can transform it for 6 mana, becomes a 3/5 that has that same ability that creatures with power less than it can't block, and when it hits the opponent, you make a 3/2 Eldrazi token. From a gameplay perspective, generally how these decks play out is the first 4 turns, 5 turns are just, a standard red-green aggro beatdown deck. You're going to be affecting the board. Your werewolves aren't going to be transforming right away unless your opponent stumbles. And this is one of the really punishing things about the werewolf deck facing it is if your opponent plays a 2-mana werewolf and you don't have a 2-drop and it flips, sometimes that just runs away with the game. So really do want to make sure that you have a good curve in this set so you don't just get run over by werewolves. But yeah, as the player playing the werewolf deck, it's not like you're holding up mana every single turn in the early parts of the game. You're playing your creatures for the first 4 or 5 turns, and then, after that, you can decide, okay, do I want to activate an ability? Do I want to cast an instant? You still want to get on board first before you plan to flip your werewolves. 2 really, really strong werewolves, and these are just good cards in any decks, but, happen to be werewolves. One of the best uncommons in the set, Duskwatch Recruiter. This is 1 and a red for a 2/2 werewolf at uncommon. Has a 2 and a green activated ability that says look at the top 3 cards of your library. You can take a creature card from among them, put it into your hand. The backside of this is a 3/3 that says creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. A really, really strong card. Just, if unanswered, will take over the game very, very quickly, either on turn 2 or later in the game when you're just drawing your deck. The other one here, Smoldering Werewolf. This is 2 red for a 3/2. When it enters, it deals 1 damage to 2 target creatures. Then you can transform it for 4 red, transforms into a 6/4, and whenever this thing attacks, it deals 2 damage to any target. And then some really, really strong werewolf rares. I'm not going to talk about rares for all of the archetypes, but I do want to call them out when they're some of the better ones in the set. Huntmaster of the Fells, notably a mythic down to rare. So this is 2 red-green for a 2/2 werewolf. When it enters, you make a 2/2 and you gain 2 life, which is just great on its own, right? Like 4 mana, make 2 2/2s, gain 2 life. And then when it flips, it transforms into a 4/4 trample that says when this transforms, it deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker, and then 2 damage to target creature that player controls. If you don't transform this at all, it's great. If you can transform it once, it's phenomenal. And if you can keep flipping it back and forth, you're going to easily win that game. And then Mare of Averbrook. I was just talking a minute ago about werewolves that if you flip them right away and your opponent doesn't have a 2, they just run away with the game. This is the epitome of that. It's 1 and a green for a 1/1 at rare. It says other humans you control get +1/+1, and then it flips if no spells were cast at the beginning of the upkeep. Flips into Hellpack Alpha, which is a 3/3. It says each other creature that's a wolf or a werewolf gets +1/+1, and at the beginning of your end step, you make a 2/2 wolf token. So just as early as turn 3, you can be pumping out a 2/2 every single turn. That is actually a 3/3 if the alpha stays flipped. One thing actually to add on to the end of talking about werewolves here, I did miss that there was another sort of pseudo gold card. So this is Wild Hunger. Really strong trick. 2 and a green for an instant at uncommon. Target creature gets +3/+1 and gains trample until the end of turn. Flashback for 3 and a red. Strong card, responsible for a ton of damage. I would hesitate to cut this from any of my werewolf decks. Next up, we've got blue-black zombies. And if you played Midnight Hunt, you might remember how busted blue-black was in that set. They actually intentionally, in this set, left out a lot of the Midnight Hunt cards. There's actually not very many zombies from that set. Not many Decay cards. Decay was that mechanic that, generally a lot of the cards with Decayed were just juiced a little bit more than I think they expected them to. I still think this deck is pretty good. It's still pretty supported, but not going to be quite the glory days of Midnight Hunt. Broadly, what you're doing with zombies is you're trying to create a board stall. You're trying to gum up the ground with tokens. You're trying to sacrifice your zombies for value. There's, of course, cards that specifically reward you for having zombies in play. The gold uncommon here, this is one of the few cards from Midnight Hunt. Blade Stitch Scob, really strong card. Blue-black for a 2/3 at uncommon. It's a zombie, and other zombies you control get +1/+0. Blue-black also gets a second Signpost uncommon, which is not nearly as strong, but a playable card. 2 and a blue for a 1/1 zombie. When it comes into play, you make a 2/2 zombie, and you can pay 2 and a black to give target zombie death touch until end of turn. When you're drafting your zombie deck, you kind of have a column A, column B style of drafting. Column A being the things that are good to sacrifice fodder, token makers, and column B being ways to use all that sacrifice fodder. So some of the better fodder is Giss's Bidding. This is 2 black for a sorcery at common. Create 2/2 black zombie tokens. It also has a madness cost of 2 and a black. And we're going to deep dive on madness when we get to vampires, because that's the vampires mechanic. But if you haven't seen madness before, all it is when you discard this card, you discard it into exile, and when you do, you can cast it for its madness cost. So basically, instead of paying 4 mana, you can pay 3 mana, and madness also works at instant speed. So you could do this on your opponent's turn if you had an instant speed discard outlet. Another pretty good sacrifice fodder card, Wretched Throng, 1 and a blue for a 2/2 zombie. When this creature dies, you may search your library for a card named Wretched Throng, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So this is sort of a collect-em-all card. You want multiple copies of this. I think you could play this card if you only had 2 copies, but ideally, you're looking for 3 or 4. You don't really want to go above that 4 number, because the problem there is that if you have too many copies, you end up with too many of them in your opening hand, and then some of them don't die into 2/1, so they're just 2 mana 2/1s, and that's not a very good card. And things to do with your token fodder. So 2 cards that did make their way over from Midnight Hunt that were very strong. Ecstatic Awakener. I imagine this is going to be one of the best commons in the set. It was back in Midnight Hunt. This is a single black mana 1/1 that you can pay 3 mana, sacrifice a creature, draw a card, and then transform this creature. The backside is just a 4/4, so it's a 1/1 that you can pay 3 to sack anything, a zombie token, whatever it is, to draw a card and turn into a 4/4. Really strong card, probably deceptively strong, actually, if you haven't played with it before. And then Siege Zombie. This is 1 and a black for a 2/2 zombie at common. Tap 3 untapped creatures you control. Each opponent loses 1 life. Really good in a board stall. Really good if you have any chip damage, any flyers, any way to gum up the ground. Kills your opponent pretty reliably if you can create that board stall. Then we've got some strong uncommons here. Compelling Deterrence is a 1 and a blue bounce spell at uncommon. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. But if you control a zombie, that player discards the card, so just very, very efficient removal spell. Archghoul of Thraben is a 2 and a black 3/2 uncommon zombie. Then whenever this creature or another zombie dies, you look at the top card of your library. If it's a zombie, put it into your hand. And Haunted Dead, another nice one here. 4 mana, 3 and a black for a 2/2 uncommon zombie. When it enters, you make a 1/1 spirit token. It also has an ability you can activate from the graveyard. 2 mana, discard 2 cards, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So that can help you enable your madness if you want, or just, in the late game, cash in 2 lands or something, bring this back. Another card that is deceptively strong, especially if you are able to pair it with some madness cards. We've got Biolume Egg, which is a really strong blue uncommon if you can enable it. I think blue-black is generally the only place that's going to be good. So this is 2 and a blue for an 0/4 defender. When it enters, you scry 2, and then when you sacrifice this creature, return to the battlefield transformed at the beginning of the next end step, and it comes back as a 4/4 that says sacrifice 2 islands. This creature can't be blocked this turn. So, sack this to your Ecstatic Awakener, or sack this to Eaten Alive, which is a card that you're going to be very familiar with if you played Foundations. Eaten Alive, for those who don't know, single black mana sorcery, exile target creature or planeswalker, but you have to pay an additional cost of sacrificing a creature or paying 3 and a black. Another way you can sacrifice Biolume Egg, or just make any use of sacrifice fodder, is the Emerge creatures. So as an example here, we've got Wretched Griff, which is a 7 mana colorless common. It's a 3/4 flyer, and when you cast this spell, draw a card. But it also has Emerge, which is kind of a funny mechanic if you haven't seen this. So it says Emerge for 5 and a blue, and it says you may cast this spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the Emerge cost reduced by that creature's mana value. So if you're sacking the egg, for example, you're going to pay 3 mana, 2 and a blue. Biolume Egg being a 3 mana card kind of adds on to the Emerge cost. So you sack the egg, you get your 4/4. Wretched Griff comes in as a 4 mana, 3/4 flyer that draws a card. That's a pretty good deal. And then 2 rares to call out here. So the busted rare of the bunch, Grimgrin Corpseborn, is a 3 blue-black 5/5 zombie at Mythic. It enters tapped and doesn't untapped, but you can sacrifice a creature, untap Grimgrin, put a counter on it, and when Grimgrin attacks, destroy target creature, defending player controls, and then put a +1/+1 counter on Grimgrin. So, as long as you have any amount of sack fodder, this card's going to take over the game. And a really cool one, this was a great build around in Crimson Vow, Necro Duality, another mythic here. 3 and a blue, enchantment. Whenever a non-token zombie you control enters, create a token that's a copy of that card. I think this is a legit card. If you've got 12-ish zombies in your deck, I think you should play this card, and it does tend to be pretty strong, especially when a lot of the zombies have decent enter the battlefield effects. Next, we've got red-black vampires, and this is my take for one of the best decks in the format. I don't know if it's going to be the actual best one, but it just looks really, really strong and really, really supported. So, the gold uncommon is one that we've seen very recently. If you played Pioneer Masters, just one of the best uncommons in that set. Blood Tithe Harvester. Red-black for a 3/2. When this enters, you make a blood token. If you're not familiar with blood tokens, they're artifacts that say pay 1 and tap this to discard a card, sacrifice this token, and draw a card. Basically, you get to rummage. Harvester also says you can tap it, sack this creature. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is twice the number of blood tokens you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So just by itself, an extremely powerful card, but also very synergistic with the vampire's main mechanic, which is madness, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. So madness, also kind of a column A, column B thing where you want discard outlets plus madness cards. One of the things people get kind of mixed up with if they haven't played with madness before is you can't just discard a madness card. It doesn't work like that. You actually need a discard outlet to be able to pay its madness cost. Usually the advantage of a madness cost is it tends to be cheaper than the actual mana cost on the card, but also, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, is if you have a sorcery speed madness card and you madness it out, you can actually cast it at instant speed. Also, creatures. You can cast creatures as if they had flash if you madness them out. The majority of the madness cards are just pretty strong. One of the more important ones to call out here, Fiery Temper. 1 red for an instant at uncommon. It deals 3 damage to any target, but madness cost of a single red mana. So basically, if you madness it, it's a lightning bolt. As far as discard outlets go, so some of the better ones here are Olivia's Dragoon, which is 1 and a black for a 2/2 common. It's a vampire. You can discard a card. This creature gains flying until end of turn, so you can just do that at any time on your opponent's turn. Fury Blade Vampire, another pretty good one here. 1 and a red for a 1/2 trample at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you can discard a card. If you do, this creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn. We've also got Faithless Looting at common in this set. So this is a single red mana sorcery. Draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Flash it back for 2 and a red, so that's casted from your graveyard if you haven't seen Flashback before. You don't just want to put this card in your deck if you don't have madness cards, but if you do have madness cards, it's really, really strong. Like, if you are able to madness out 2 really cheap things, that's great, but even discarding, a land and a madness card after paying 1 mana, you're going to feel pretty good about that. 2 more awesome discard outlets. Voldaren Epicure, awesome card, very easy to overlook if you haven't played with this before. Single red mana for a 1/1. When it enters, it deals a damage to each opponent, and you make a blood token. There's also Lightning Axe at uncommon, single red mana for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this, either discard a card or pay 5 life. Lightning Axe deals 5 damage to target creature. So you can just imagine turns where you go, cast my Lightning Axe on my opponent's turn as they're attacking. I kill one of your attackers. I flash in a vampire with madness, eat one of their things. Like this is a card that can set up a lot of blowouts. Some vampire payoffs here. Stensia Masquerade. This one's a bit funny looking, maybe a little bit hard to evaluate, but I do think pretty strong. 2 and a red for an enchantment at uncommon. It says attacking creatures you control have first strike, and whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's also got madness for 2 and a red. So you can imagine this as, you've got the Dragoons in play, you attack, your opponent blocks it there 2/2, you discard this card, flash this in, kind of acts as a combat trick, and then makes all your vampires attack better as the game goes on. Another one here, Indulgent Aristocrat, single black mana for a 1/1 lifelink at uncommon. And it says 2 mana, sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Sacking a creature, hefty cost, so if you play this card, you need to be very, very vampire heavy, so you're putting a counter on basically all your cards, but if you are there, it's a good card. Another vampire payoff here, kind of a sleeper one, Neonate's Rush. This is a card that took people a while to catch on to how good this card was back in the day. So this is 2 and a red for an instant at common. It costs 1 less to cast if you control a vampire, and it deals 1 damage to target creature, 1 damage to that creature's controller, and you draw a card. So if you're playing a vampire deck, it's 2 mana to draw a card and deal damage to the opponent and 1 creature they control, and there are a good number of X1 creatures in the set. You're going to see throughout the set a few pinging effects, and I think those are going to be pretty strong. This might look like a low impact effect, but when you can kill your opponent's 1 toughness creature and draw a card for 2 mana, you're going to feel phenomenal about that. And even if you don't, sometimes you just use this to finish off a creature in combat and you draw a card, so it's not like you're 2-for-1ing yourself or anything. And then the cherry on top of all of this is Black Red Vampires gets a lot of really, really strong rares, and there's quite a few here, so I'm not going to read them all out. I'm just going to read out the names and give you the gist of them. Bloodline Keeper is a really great card. Great in any deck, but at its best in vampire decks. It's a 4 mana 3/3 flyer at Mythic. Taps to make a 2/2 flyer. Transforms into a 5/5 flyer that gives your vampires +2/+2 and still has that tap to make a 2/2 vampire token ability. And then a classic, Olivia Valderin. This one's on constructed play back in the day. This is a 2 black-red 3/3 flyer that has the ability to pay 2 mana to ping stuff and put a counter on Olivia. You can then 4/5 mana steal the things that you've pinged. Bloodhall Priest is a really good madness card. Captivating Vampire is a 3 mana lord for your vampires that steals other creatures if you have enough vampires in play. Valderin Bloodcaster, 2 mana 2/1 flyer. Then whenever a creature you control dies, you make a blood token and then it transforms into a 3/3 flyer with other good abilities. And then one more here, Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. This is the 3 mana Sorin that was banned in Pioneer this year. You're not going to be putting Vein Rippers in play necessarily, but still a very strong card in vampire decks. So yeah, I'm just pretty high on this deck right now. The combo of a really strong Signpost Uncommon, good commons, good payoffs, and just a ton of good rares that you could open or get past. Blue-White Spirits is up next, and Blue-White is just your classic Blue-White flyer, tempo-style limited deck. Just like Red-Green Werewolves, it doesn't actually get a gold Signpost Uncommon, but it does get Spectral Shepherd, which is 3 and a white for a 2/2 flying spirit, and you can pay 1 and a blue to return target spirit you control to its owner's hand. This card's okay, nothing phenomenal, but its uses are like saving creatures from removal spells and reusing enter the battlefield effects. I think the power of blue-white actually lies with the 1-drops, the common 1-drops. So these are the cards I think you really want to keep an eye out for. Lunarch Veteran being the first one. A single white mana for a 1/1 human cleric. When another creature you control enters, you gain a life. Disturb for 1 and a white, which means you can cast this card from your graveyard, and if you do, it comes back as the backside. Luminous Phantom, which is a 1 mana 1/1 flying spirit. Whenever another creature you control leaves the battlefield, you gain 1 life. And this is exactly the kind of card you want in your flyer deck on turn 1. Just a card that will gain you a bunch of life, buff your life total as your flyers fly over. You can chump block with this on a future turn and then turn into a flying threat. You can mill this in some cases. And then the other one here, Lantern Bearer, another Disturb card. This is a 1 mana 1/1 spirit with flying. Disturb cost is 2 and a blue, so cast it from your graveyard. It turns into an aura on the backside. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying. With any tempo deck, the 1-drops are going to be super important. So yeah, like I said, I really think you should focus here. But some other cards to note. Towergeist, this wasn't uncommon, now shifted down to common. 3 and a blue for a 2/2 flying spirit. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them to your hand, the other into the graveyard. So just generically pretty strong card. Some lesser good cards, but cards that you don't mind filling out your curve with. Apothecary Geist, 3 and a white for a 2/3 spirit flyer. When it enters, you gain 3 life if you control another spirit. And Battleground Geist, 5 mana, 4 and a blue for a 3/3 flying spirit at common. Other spirits you control get +1/+0. Essence Flux is a notable card here. Single blue mana for an instant at common. Exile target creature you control, then return to the battlefield under its owner's control. And if it's a spirit, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So a little bit like Spectral Shepherd in what it can do. It saves your creatures from removal or re-triggers enter the battlefield effects. I think this is actually one of the more unassuming cards for this deck. Very powerful. I would play, 2-3 copies if I had enough non-creature slots in my deck. This Spirit Tempo deck, it is a beatdown deck. It's an aggro deck to some degree, so you want to make sure you keep your creature count high. But, if you've got like 15 creatures, 3-4 removal spells, the rest of your spell slots or a few Essence Fluxes, I think that's totally fine. Geistlight Snare, another pretty nice one here. 2 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. It costs 1 less to cast if you have a spirit. It also casts another 1 less to cast if you control an enchantment, and it's a mana leak variant. So it's this counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. If you can get that down to 1 or 2 mana, that's fantastic. Lantern's Lift, the backside of Lantern Bearer, like I mentioned, is an enchantment, so that's an easy way to get an enchantment on the battlefield. And then a really important one, I actually think this is probably like the Signpost Uncommon. This is like the uncommon for the deck, one that I would be very happy to take early and sort of build around, but it is also just good in any blue deck. So this is Nebelgast Herald, 2 and a blue for a 2/1 flash flyer at uncommon. It's a spirit, of course. And whenever this or another spirit enters, tap target creature an opponent controls. Really strong card. And then an honorary spirits card. It's more of a black-white card, but I wouldn't mind splashing this card if I had a little bit of fixing. There's a little bit of fixing in the set, not a ton, but there's Evolving Wilds, there's Traveler's Amulet, and Lingering Souls is just one of the best cards in the entire set. So if you haven't played Lingering Souls, this is 2 and a white for a sorcery at uncommon. You make 2 1/1 flying white creature spirit tokens. flashback for 1 and a black. You could just play this as 3 mana, make 2 1/1 tokens. That would be okay, especially if you have cards that care about spirits. But I think if you have this card, I would be looking to actively pick up an Evolving Wilds or 2 to make sure you can flash it back, because if you can flash this card back, like I said, it's just one of the best cards in the set. And then rounding out the creature type decks, we've got green-white humans. So green-white humans is a typical green-white aggro deck. You're kind of just playing cheap creatures, pump spells, mass pump spells sometimes. The gold uncommon here, Join the Dance, makes tokens. It's green-white for a sorcery. You make 2 1/1 white human creature tokens, and it's got flashback for 3 green-white. The pseudo gold card here is Travel Preparations. This one was a classic from back in the day, OG Innistrad. 1 and a green for a sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to each of 2 target creatures, and flashback for 1 and a white. Deceptively strong if you haven't played with this card before. Just so much power and toughness for not that much mana. Very, very flexible card. You know, you can put it on flyers, you can make better blockers if you really need to, but mostly the play pattern with this is like, play a 1-drop, play a 2-drop, play a 3-drop. On turn 4, you play this, flash it back, your board just got really big really quick. Some uncommons that call out humans. Butcher's Cleaver. So I often warn against Equipment Unlimited because most of it's not very good. But Butcher's Cleaver is an exception. So this is 3 mana for an Equipment at uncommon. The equipped creature gets +3/+0. And as long as it's a human, it has lifelink. Really nice keyword. Equip cost is 3. So, you know, it's a little bit hefty, but it's not like you're going Butcher's Cleaver on 3, equip it on 4. You're generally going to have this as like the last thing you do, the mana sink after you've played out all your creatures and you're sort of empty-handed. And it's a really, really strong tool for racing, having your 1/1s attack through your opponent's stuff. A good way to make use of your tokens. Another one, Hamlet Captain. This one's pretty strong. 1 and a green for a 2/2 at uncommon. Whenever this creature attacks or blocks other humans you control, get +1/+1 until end of turn. There aren't a ton of notable commons that are humans or help out humans. I think some of the ones that specifically call out, oh, when a human does this, or if you have a human, aren't that important, aren't that strong. Like, you could fill your deck with them, but it's stuff like a 2 mana 2/2 that whenever a human enters, that 2/2 gets +1/+1, right? Kind of minor stuff. But of course, you have to call out Thraben Inspector as one of the best commons in the set. Good in any white deck, but gonna be at its best in a human deck. Single white mana for a 1/2 human soldier. When it enters, investigate. So Novice Inspector from MKM as a more recent analog. And then as far as other uncommons go, there aren't a ton of things like the Butcher's Cleaver or Hamlet Captain that specifically say, if you have a human, you know, do this thing. But there are a lot of just strong humans in this set. So Slayer of the Wicked is a really strong uncommon. 3 and a white for a 3/2. When it enters, you can destroy target werewolf, zombie, or vampire. Just very strong if you're facing a red-black deck or a green-red deck or something. But even if you're not, your average deck is going to have some of these creature types. It's not going to be a dead card very often. Another uncommon here that was underrated the first time around in Shadows over Innistrad was also underrated back when we got Shadows over Innistrad Remastered on Arena, and I would imagine it might be underrated this time around too. Town Gossipmonger. Single white mana for a 1/1 human at uncommon. Tap it and tap another untapped creature you control. Transform this creature. It transforms into Incited Rabble, which is a 2/3. Has to attack each combat if able, but you can pay 2 mana to have this creature get +1/+0 until end of turn. So the play pattern with this is generally play this on 1, play a 2, transform right away, and effectively you've played a 1 mana 2/3 that can pump itself. So just a very strong card for the mana you're paying. 2 more bangers here. Ambitious Farmhand is 1 and a white for a 1/1 at uncommon. When it enters, you search for a plains, put it into your hand. Then it has a Coven ability, which is if you control 3 creatures or more with different powers, you can activate this. So 1 white, transform this creature, turns into a 3/3 lifelink. Great card. 2 mana 1/1, draws you a land, turns into a 3/3 lifelinker eventually. And then one more awesome uncommon human, Fiend Hunter, 1 white for a 1/3. When it enters, you may exile target creature. When this leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Be careful, this is the old templating. What you want to do with this card, if you are facing it, is you want to make sure the ability resolves first. So usually with these kind of cards, the more modern update, what you want to do is when they play it and target your creature, let's say you have an instant speed removal spell in your hand, you go, okay, I'm going to kill your creature that's going to exile my creature before that ability resolves, because then my creature will never leave the battlefield. But if you do that with Fiend Hunter, the rules are such, because the 2 paragraphs are separate, that you'll kill the Fiend Hunter, the creature that they target will get exiled, and then because the Fiend Hunter is already gone, it can't return it. It's a really weird little rules quirk. If you want to look up the details, you know, they're out there. But long story short, if your opponent has a Fiend Hunter, don't kill it with the trigger on the stack. You'll be very sad. Now we move into the enemy color pair decks. These are not creature type decks. They're kind of all doing their own thing. I think some of these decks are a little less supported than others. There's two decks that stand out to me, the blue decks actually, blue-red and blue-green, that I think are doing their own thing, very well supported. I'd be happy to move into those decks. And then the other three, black-white, green-black, and red-white, they're all fine decks. If you end up there, it's not a mistake or anything. I think there's just less reason to go into them, less synergy going on there. So I'm going to give the bulk of the time to blue-red spells and blue-green, because I think these are actually really sweet decks. I think these are going to be pretty strong and some of the cooler decks to draft in the format. Some of the ones that I imagine people are going to be fighting over because they harken back to the OG build-arounds of spider spawning and burning vengeance. So yeah, let's just jump in and talk about it, starting with blue-red spells. So we've got two signposts here. Wandering Mind is a 1 blue-red 2/1 flyer at uncommon. When it enters, you look at the top 6 cards of your library. You can take a non-creature, non-land, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. Just a great card. Second one here, Mystic Retrieval, is 3 and a blue for a sorcery at uncommon. Return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Flashback for 2 and a red. So this one looks a little bit clunky, and it is. But if you've got specific spells, I'm talking, there's a few finishers that we're going to see in a few minutes for these red-blue spells deck, specific spells you really want to buy back, or if you have enough discard or self-mill and you're able to some amount of the time just get that card in your graveyard, use the flashback, that's a fine thing too. So not a card you want in every deck, but I don't think it takes too much to want it in most of your blue-red deck. We have some great spells at common, Silent Departure being one of them. Single blue mana for a sorcery. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Flashback for 5 mana. This thing punishes big vanilla creatures so hard. Just if your opponent ever plays a 4 or 5 mana creature with no enter the battlefield effect, and you send it back to their hand for 1 mana, and then you just have this thing sitting in the grave and you can do it again. Very strong card. Gonna be one of the top commons. Another one, this one's a little more straightforward. People more familiar with Abrade, 2 mana, deal 3 or destroy target artifact, but I think the bread and butter at common for your spells deck. And then one thing with these spells decks is that I think they can be kind of aggressive or kind of controlling. If you're more of a aggressive version of the deck, I think you're going to want this package of Ancestral Anger plus Festival Crasher. Ancestral Anger is single red mana for a sorcery. Target creature gains trample and gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of Ancestral Angers in your graveyard +1. Draw a card. And Festival Crasher is 1 red for a 1/3. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, this creature gets +2/+0 until end turn. So yeah, those two cards play very nicely together. There's also Thermo Alchemist, which I think is at its best in the more aggressive decks, but could be played in more of a controlling deck too. This is 1 red for an 0/3 defender at uncommon. Tap it to deal damage to each opponent, and then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you untap this creature. But if you want to take a more controlling approach to the spells deck, there's some really nice engine cards, finishers. Rise from the Tides being one of them. 5 and a blue for a sorcery at uncommon. Create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token for each instant or sorcery card in your graveyard. Another one here, Seize the Storm. It's a 4 and a red sorcery at common. It's got flashback for 6 and a red. And it says create a red elemental creature token with trample. This token's power and toughness are equal to the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard, plus the number of flashback spells you own in exile. And that's not a static thing. It's not just it sets the power and toughness when you cast it. It will grow the more spells you cast. With both of these cards, you really want to lean heavy into spells. The best version of Innistrad spell decks generally don't have any creatures in them. They're all just removal spells, mill spells, cantrips, and then these kind of finishers. Ideally, maybe you have one exceptionally good creature, but you don't need any creatures to win if you have these kind of spells. Any spells really want a density of spells. This isn't the kind of blue-red spell deck where you're I've got 12 creatures and some non-creatures. If you've got Rise from the Tides or Seize the Storm, you really want to have as few creatures as possible. And then there's Burning Vengeance, which is 2 and a red for an enchantment at uncommon. Whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, this enchantment deals 2 damage to any target. So not only do you need spells to make this card work, powerful card, by the way, but it does require a few hoops to jump through. Not only do you need spells, but you need flashback spells to really make this trigger consistently. And not only do you need flashback spells, but you need a density of them. So I think the bare minimum you want for Burning Vengeance is 7, 8. At that number, you're going to get 2 shocks out of the deal. Ideally, this is a thing that just comes down and you start killing your opponent's board, and then eventually it kills them. But I think it's a little bit trickier to piece together than the Seize the Storm, Rise the Tides decks, because like I said, you do need specifically flashback cards. I guess you could also play Disturb cards, because, you know, when you cast a Disturb card from your graveyard, that will trigger Burning Vengeance, but then it gets a little tricky because those are creatures, and if you're putting Burning Vengeance in your Rise from the Tides and Seize the Storm deck, then you've got, like, creatures in your deck that really, really just wants as many non-creatures as you can. So I would say proceed with caution with Burning Vengeance. It is a very powerful card, but I think needs a more specific deck to get there. And then one kind of cute thing I thought was cool is they did find room to include all of the Delver of Secrets and its variants. So we've got Delver of Secrets, Aberrant Researcher, and then the rare Ghost of Perfection. Not going to read all these out because it's, you know, a million words in all of them. But basically, they're all creatures that reward you for having a bunch of spells in your deck. Ghost of Perfection. I guess I will read this one out. This is 5 mana for a 5/4 flyer at rare. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you make a 1/1 blue human creature token, and then it flips if you have 3 or more wizards, and it turns into a 6/5 flyer that turns all your wizards basically into the flipped Delver of Secrets, turns them into 3/2 flyers. Like, this is the kind of creature that even in your super heavy spell decks where you don't met very many creatures, this would be an exception. You know, this is a creature, of course, you're happy to play in your decks that don't want that many creatures. Moving on to blue-green Self-Mill. This is another pretty sweet deck, and this is just a deck that, as the name implies, just wants you to put your library in your graveyard as quick as possible, very literally sometimes, because one of the payoffs is Laboratory Maniac, which is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 uncommon. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So kind of a cool one. Blue-green is sort of the inverse of blue-red spells, where blue-red spells really wants you to have as few creatures as possible. Blue-green wants you to have as many creatures as possible. Like, I'm talking 20, 21 if you can really get your hands on that many good creatures that belong in this deck. Because 2 of the best payoffs for self-milling care about how many creature cards are in your graveyard, not just any card. And if you're just milling, and you're just milling lands and instant sorceries, they're not really going to do that much. So Vile Spawn Spider, one of them here, this is blue-green for a 2/3 reach. At the beginning of your upkeep, you mill a card. You can pay 2 blue-green to tap it, sack this creature, create a 1/1 green insect for each creature card in your graveyard, activate only as a sorcery. The other card, this is the OG Innistrad build-around, Spider Spawning. Also, really wants to have a lot of creature cards. So this is 4 and a green for a sorcery at uncommon. It's got flashback for 6 in a black. And so you're going to be splashing this card, but it's kind of the home for it. Black-green, I think, doesn't actually support this card all that well, at least not as well as blue-green does. So Spider Spawning is a sorcery that creates a 1/2 green spider token with reach for each creature card in your graveyard. Those 1/2 reach creatures, if you haven't played with Spider Spawning before, they make it impossible, almost impossible, for your opponent to attack into you. Because let's just say your opponent attacks in with a 3/3, right? And you block with 3 of these spiders, only one of those spiders dies. So it's very, very difficult for your opponent to have a profitable attack after you make, 6 spiders or something. And then you flash it back, you do it again, maybe you make 7 spiders. It's very easy to win the game at that point when you've just got a bunch of tokens. And there's a lot of enablers for this deck. So one of them being Eccentric Farmer. This is 2 and a green for a 2/3. When it enters, you mill 3 cards, then you can return a land card from your graveyard to your hand. Grapple with the Past. This is one of the few instant sorceries that I'd be happy running in this kind of deck. So this is 1 and a green for an instant. Mill 3 cards, then you may return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. We've also got Deranged Assistant, which is kind of a weird blue mana dork. So it's 1 and a blue for a 1/1 common. It taps to mill a card and add colorless mana. We've also got a split payoff / enabler in Splinter Fright. This is 2 and a green for a Star Trample at uncommon. Power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Again, another thing that keys off of only creature cards. At the beginning of your upkeep, you mill 2 cards. We've got some transforming blue uncommons here that play well in this deck. Covetous Castaway, 1 and a blue for a 1/3 human. When it dies, you mill 3 cards, and it's got Disturb for 3 blue. Flips into a 3/4 flying. When this card enters, you can shuffle up to 3 cards from your graveyard into your library. The other one here is Grizzled Angler. It's a 3 mana, 2/3 in blue. Taps to mill 2 cards. Then if there is a colorless creature in your graveyard, transform this creature. That part's not going to happen all that often, but we will get to a notable colorless creature you might want in these decks in a second. But anyways, if you do choose to flip this, sometimes you don't want to. Sometimes you want to keep it there to mill. It flips into Grizzly Anglerfish, which is a 4/5 that has the activated ability 6 mana. Creatures your opponents control attack this turn if able. Which, when you've got a 4/5 and ostensibly some other pretty big creatures, that can be not great for your opponent to have to attack. The colorless card in question that I think you do want to copy in most of these decks is Epitaph Golem. So this is a 5 mana, 3/5 artifact creature at common. You can pay 2 to put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. So the way you want to use this card is, 1, you can buy back any key pieces. Maybe your Laboratory Maniac died, you put that on the bottom of your library, eventually draw it again. Two, once you get low enough in your library, you're at 5 cards, you play this, you can just start stacking your deck, right? You get to choose the exact order that you want to draw your cards in. You turn your graveyard back into your library, and you kind of make sure you're drawing a good, impactful spell every single turn. Or just more simply, in a really long game, this just prevents you from decking. So, you're both at like 10 cards in the library, you slam your Epitaph Golem, and the game becomes like, all right, can I survive? Or can my opponent kill this golem? If they can't, then they're just going to deck, and I'm not going to. And then another colorless card here, one that's pretty well known, Emrakul, the Promised End. So 13 mana mythic. It's a 13/13 flying trample protection from instants. It says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each card type in your graveyard, so sort of Delirium-esque. And when you cast this spell, you take control of your opponent's next turn. They get another turn after that, but you can do a lot of damage on that extra turn, even if they do get to have one more turn of their own. So yeah, this card does play well in a self-mill deck, of course, but you do want to diversify your card types more than you normally would if you didn't have this card, right? Because it does have kind of that Delirium-esque ability. It's not a card that you want in your 20 creature decks. You do want to have a good mix of instant sorceries, maybe enchantments if you can, so that this gets down to 8, 9 mana. The last 3 decks here, we're not going to do too much of a deep dive because I think they're a little more straightforward than the other decks, also just a little bit less synergistic. I don't think there's too many kind of confusing or unintuitive things when you're drafting these decks. You're just kind of going to draft these when your colors are open. Black-green, Signpost Uncommon, Grizzly Ghoul, which is 2 black-green, 4/3 trample, enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for each creature that died this turn. Not super strong. The red-white one, pretty good. Markov Waltzer, 2 red-white for a 1/3 flying haste. And at the beginning of your combat each turn, up to 2 target creatures you control get +1/+0. Black-white's uncommon, Flesh Taker, white-black for a 2/2. Whenever you sacrifice a creature, you gain a life, scry 1. Also has the ability pay 1, sack a creature. This creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This card is pretty strong. I actually like this one. I think if you want to kind of concept black-white, it's very similar to what black-blue is doing, just replace the blue zombie cards with some white tokeny cards. And like I mentioned before, really the star of the show for black-white is Lingering Souls. Although Lingering Souls I kind of just see as a white card, right? I think you can just kind of consider it as, well, it's a white card and you're going to want to splash the black flashback cost in basically any deck. All right, wrapping up now, just a few more things to cover. There are the meld cards in this set. If you haven't seen the meld cards, they are 3 pairs of cards. I believe there's a common/uncommon pair, a pair where there's 2 rares. That's the Handweaver Garrison and Handweaver Battlements. It's like a creature and a land. And then there's Brazella, the 2 angels that fuse together to make a gigantic angel. But basically, if you haven't seen these before, is when you get them on the battlefield together, they actually transform into a mega card. You flip them over, you put them together, and they become some giant monster. So the common/uncommon example here, Midnight Scavengers is the common. This is 5 mana, 4 black for a 3/3. When it enters, you may return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. The uncommon here is Graph Rats. It's 1 black for a 2/1. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you both own and control this creature and a creature named Midnight Scavengers, exile them and then meld them into Chittering Host. Chittering Host being a 6/5 haste menace that when it enters, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain menace until end of turn. So kind of a sweet thing. One kind of cool thing I like, that a little bit of adjustment. Graph Rats used to be a common. They've shifted it up to uncommon. I think that makes a lot of sense because it's just a 2/1. You don't want to have this random 2/1 for 2 crowding out packs. So, the person that wants the Graph Rats, they're going to be able to have it. Quick notes on fixing. There's not a ton of it in the set. There is Evolving Wilds. There's also Traveler's Amulet, which is a single mana for an artifact at common. Pay 1, sack it, go search your library for a basic land, put into your hand. There's also the Cycle of Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow rare lands, the ones that come into play untapped if you have 2 or more lands in play already. There's some rare fixing here and there. There's a little bit of green fixing, but this set is not super splash heavy. I think more often than not, you're going to be 2 colors or 2 colors with a very light splash. And then just a few cards I want to call out that I think are a little bit easy to overlook. Brambleworm being one of them. This is the 7 mana, 7/6. It's a common. Wasn't uncommon back in the day in Crimson Vow. It's got Reach, Trample. When it enters, you gain 5 life, and you can pay 3 mana, exile it from your graveyard, you gain 5 life. This is a creature you're going to want in any slower green deck. Blue-green loves it. Sometimes you self-mill it, and you just get the 3 mana, exile from your grave, gain 5 life. That can really save you. It's a great stabilizing play. One of the best sort of Honey Mammoth variants they've ever printed. Noose Constrictor up next. This one was underrated in Shadows over Innistrad Remastered. It was underrated when we were drafting Eldritch Moon. I imagine it's going to be pretty underrated just in general still. So this is 1 green for a 2/2 at uncommon. It's got Reach, and it says discard a card, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So if you've never played with like a wild mongrel, that's a really old card at this point, these cards are deceptively powerful because you can't really get into combat with them very easily. You attack into your opponent's 2/2 with this, they can't really block. You get to cast a free +1/+1 combat trick. As the game goes on, sometimes this becomes a threat of just like, well, if I don't block this, my opponent just pitches their hand and kills me. It's really good with madness cards because it's a free discard enabler. Just one of the best 2-drops in this set. Don't overlook this one. And then last card I'm going to call out here is Mistraven. This is 2 blue for a flying 2/2. When it enters, return target creature to its owner's hand. I imagine this is going to be like top 5 uncommon. Manowar is great. Flying Manowar is even better. One of the best tempo cards they've ever printed. So yeah, it's a little bit boring, a little bit vanilla, but don't overlook this one. Really, really powerful. Anyways, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Hope you enjoyed this and hope you do well in your events. Hope you open some money. If you like this, if you enjoyed the show, do consider checking out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Help the show keep going. We are a crowdfunded show here on the channel. And, if you want to support in a different way, a subscribe, a like, a comment, all that stuff's really good. Anyways, thanks for watching. We'll see you later.